The debt that broke the empire, May 8, 1945. The streets of London explode in celebration. Churchill stands on the balcony of Buckingham Palace as a million voices roar. We're told Britain won the war. We're told the empire stood firm against tyranny. That's the story in the textbooks. But here's the truth. Britain didn't win World War II. It survived it. And survival came with a price tag that would dismantle the greatest empire in human history. The war wasn't lost on the battlefield. It was lost on the balance sheet. Let's rewind to 1939. The British Empire covers a quarter of the Earth's landmass. 500 million people live under the Union Jack. From Cairo to Calcutta, from Singapore to Sierra Leone, the sun never sets on British territory. Walk through London and you see monuments to centuries of conquest. The Royal Navy patrols every ocean. Sterling is the reserve currency of global trade. If you wanted to buy oil, rubber, or wheat anywhere in the world, you paid in pounds. This wasn't just military power. This was financial dominance. Britain was the central bank of human civilization. But empires don't collapse from external pressure alone. They rot from the inside. And Britain's rot was already deep by the time Hitler invaded Poland. The First World War had bled the treasury white. Britain entered 1914 as the world's largest creditor nation. It exited 1918 as a debtor. The cost of that war was £135 billion in today's money. The gold reserves were drained. The loans from America were crushing, but the empire had recovered before. It could do it again. Or so they thought. Then came September 1939. Hitler's tanks rolled into Poland. Britain declared war, and this time the financial trap was already set. Here's the problem. Britain couldn't afford another war. The Treasury knew it. The Bank of England knew it. Even Churchill knew it. The nation had £664 million in gold and foreign exchange reserves. That sounds like a fortune, but modern war is an incinerator of wealth. By 1941, those reserves were nearly gone. Britain was spending £2 million per day just to keep the lights on. The cash was evaporating. So Britain did what bankrupt nations do. It printed IOUs. But these weren't ordinary IOUs. These were called sterling balances. Here's how the scam worked. Britain needed supplies from its colonies, food from India, rubber from Malaya, oil from the Middle East. But it couldn't pay in gold. There was none left, so Britain paid in pounds. It deposited paper currency into accounts held by colonial governments. The promise was simple. After the war, these pounds could be converted into gold or dollars. Trust us, Britain said. We're good for it. Except they weren't. By 1945, the sterling balances totaled £3.7 billion. That's £80 billion in today's money. The largest creditor was India. India had accumulated £1.3 billion in sterling balances by feeding, clothing, and supplying the British war machine. Think about that. Britain fought a war for 6 years using money it borrowed from a colony it was oppressing. India paid for its own subjugation. And now, with the war over, India wanted its money back. So did Egypt, so did Iraq, so did Australia. The entire colonial world was holding a bill that Britain couldn't pay. Enter John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world. By 1945, Keynes is 62 years old and dying. His heart is failing. He can barely walk upstairs. But he's the only man with the intellect and the reputation to save Britain from financial oblivion. In August 1945, Keynes boards a plane to Washington. His mission is simple: convince the Americans to give Britain a gift of $6 billion. Not a loan, a gift, because Britain cannot afford to repay anything. Keynes calls it justice. He frames it as compensation for Britain standing alone against Hitler, while America stayed neutral. The Americans listen politely. Then they laugh in his face. The United States had its own ledger, and on that ledger, Britain looked like a bad investment. America had already lent Britain $31 billion through Lend-Lease. That program was now terminated. President Truman wanted payment. But more than that, America wanted something else: the end of the sterling area. The sterling area was a trade bloc of 50 countries that conducted business exclusively in British pounds. It was a closed economic club. American exporters couldn't penetrate it. American banks couldn't compete in it. The sterling area was the financial skeleton of the British Empire, and America wanted it dismantled. So the Americans made Keynes an offer, not a gift, a loan. $3.75 billion at 2% interest. That sounds generous, but there was a condition buried in the fine print. Article 7 of the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. This clause required Britain to make the pound fully convertible within 1 year. Convertible meant anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at a fixed rate. No restrictions. No delays. The Americans were forcing Britain to open the vault and let the world take what it wanted. Keynes knew this was suicide. But Britain had no choice. On December 6, 1945, Keynes signed the deal. He returned to London a broken man. He would be dead within 4 months. The loan bought Britain time. But time was all it bought. By July 1947, the deadline arrived. Sterling convertibility became law. Within hours, the stampede began. Every country holding pounds rushed to convert them into dollars. Egypt cashed out. India cashed out. Argentina, Sweden, and Switzerland followed. In 5 weeks, Britain hemorrhaged $1 billion. The reserves that America had just replenished were gone again. The pound was bleeding to death in real time. On August 20th, 1947, the British government suspended convertibility. The experiment had lasted 37 days. It was the most humiliating financial collapse in modern history. But the real damage wasn't the money. It was the signal. The world had just watched the British pound fail its stress test. Sterling was no longer a safe store of value. If you were a merchant in Buenos Aires or a banker in Zurich, you stopped quoting prices in pounds. You switched to dollars. The currency of empire was now a regional money, useful only within Britain's shrinking sphere. The dollar had won, and with it, American hegemony became inevitable. Britain had lost the economic war before the shooting war even ended. Meanwhile, the colonies were watching, and they were furious. India had been promised its sterling balances would be honored, but now Britain was broke and begging for payment delays. Indian leaders saw the betrayal clearly. "We funded your war," they said. "We sent 2.5 million soldiers to fight for you. We endured famine in Bengal that killed 3 million people because you diverted our grain to British troops. And now you tell us the check bounced?" The moral case for empire evaporated overnight. By 1947, India demanded independence. Britain had no leverage left to refuse. On August 15, 1947, the Union Jack came down in Delhi. The jewel in the crown was gone. The pattern repeated across the globe. Palestine, Burma, Ceylon, Malaya. One by one, the colonies broke free. Not because Britain chose to liberate them, because Britain couldn't afford to hold them. Empire is expensive. You need troops, administrators, infrastructure, and financial control. Britain had none of those things anymore. The cost of suppressing independence movements exceeded the value of the territories themselves. Sovereignty is solvency. And Britain was insolvent. By 1956, the Suez Crisis confirmed it. When Britain tried to assert military power in Egypt, America crushed them with financial sanctions. The empire was over. The accountants had won, but the debt remained. The Anglo-American loan wasn't forgiven. Britain kept paying. Every year, a check went to Washington. 2% interest compounded slowly but relentlessly. The children of Blitz survivors were still paying off their parents' war. It became a generational mortgage. British taxpayers funded schools, hospitals, and pensions, while also servicing a loan taken out before they were born. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after Keynes signed the deal. Think about that. A teenager in 1945 would be 77 years old when the debt was cleared. The war they celebrated as children haunted their retirement, and the sterling balances. India never got its full payment. Neither did Egypt. Neither did any of the colonies. Britain negotiated write-downs, payment plans, and adjustments that reduced the real value of the debt by 90%. Inflation did the rest. By the 1970s, the pounds that India had earned in 1943 were worth a fraction of their original value. It was a silent default. Not a formal bankruptcy, but a slow erosion of obligation. The colonies had funded the war effort and received pennies on the dollar. Some historians call it pragmatism. Others call it theft. The ledger tells the truth. The story of the sterling balances is not taught in most history classes. We learn about D-Day and Churchill's speeches and the Battle of Britain. We don't learn about the Treasury meetings where men in suits calculated how long they could delay payment to India. We don't learn about the cables sent from London to Cairo begging for more credit. We don't learn that the empire died not from revolution, but from insolvency, because that truth is uncomfortable. It reveals that power is not ideology or courage. Power is cash flow. Consider the scale of the delusion. In 1945, Britain still believed it was a superpower. It had a seat at Yalta alongside Roosevelt and Stalin. It occupied Germany. It held veto power at the United Nations. The maps still showed red ink across Africa and Asia, but the balance sheet told a different story. Britain was a client state of the United States, kept alive by loans and Marshall Plan aid. The sovereignty was theatrical. The real decisions were made in Washington. By the 1950s, British foreign policy was whatever American foreign policy allowed. The empire had become a subsidiary. The psychological impact was profound. A generation of Britons had grown up believing in the inevitability of British greatness. The empire was destiny. The pound was eternal. Then it all collapsed in less than a decade. The national identity fractured. Politicians promised recovery. Economists promised growth. But the numbers didn't lie. Britain's share of global GDP fell from 10% in 1945 to 3% by 1970. The factories closed. The shipyards went silent. The currency devalued again and again. By 1976, Britain was begging the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. A country that once ruled the world was now on financial life support. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't need to. They had already won. The Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the global reserve currency. Oil was priced in dollars. International debts were denominated in dollars. The Federal Reserve became the central bank of the world. America inherited the empire without firing a shot. They simply waited for Britain to drown in its own debt. And when the pound finally sank, the dollar was there to fill the void. It was the most efficient conquest in history, not through invasion, but through foreclosure. There's a document in the British National Archives that captures the moment perfectly. It's a memo from 1947, written by a Treasury official. The memo calculates how long Britain can delay payments to India without triggering a diplomatic crisis. The official suggests stretching payments over 30 years. He writes, "We must avoid the appearance of default while achieving the substance of it." Read that again. The substance of default. This wasn't mismanagement. It was policy. Britain chose to betray its creditors because the alternative was admitting bankruptcy. The empire ended not with honor, but with accounting fraud. And what about the colonies? They learned a lesson too. They learned that empire is not a partnership. It's a protection racket. You pay for security, and when the security fails, you still owe the bill. India's independence movement had always framed itself in moral terms: freedom, dignity, self-determination. But after 1945, the argument became economic. Why should we remain subjects of a bankrupt empire? Why should we subsidize Britain's decline? The sterling balances prove that colonialism was a financial scam. And once the math was exposed, the ideology collapsed. The legacy of the sterling balances echoes into the present. When countries today talk about debt forgiveness for developing nations, they're referencing this history. When economists debate the sustainability of reserve currencies, they're studying Britain's collapse. The transition from the sterling era to the dollar era is the template for understanding how financial hegemony shifts. It's not dramatic. It's not violent. It's just a slow draining of credibility until one day nobody accepts your currency anymore. And when that happens, your empire is already over. You just haven't admitted it yet. There's a final irony worth mentioning. Britain fought World War II to preserve its sovereignty and its empire. It succeeded in defeating Hitler, but in doing so it bankrupted itself and lost everything it fought to protect. The war was won on the battlefield and lost on the balance sheet. By 1950, Britain was a middle power, dependent on American aid and goodwill. The empire that had lasted 3 centuries was liquidated in 5 years. Not by revolution, not by military defeat, but by debt. The ledger had spoken, and the ledger always wins. So the next time you see footage of V-Day celebrations, remember what was happening behind the scenes. The champagne was real. The joy was real. But so was the invoice. Britain had fought the war on borrowed money and borrowed time. And when the bill came due, the empire couldn't pay. The sterling balances were the IOU that broke the greatest empire in history. 3.7 billion pounds of paper promises that turned an empire into a memory. History is not decided by battles. It's decided by balance sheets. And in 1945, Britain's balance sheet was bleeding red. If this story taught you something that textbooks didn't, subscribe to this channel. Because while the world celebrates heroes and generals, we're here digging through the ledgers and uncovering the real story. The story of how empires rise and fall, not by the sword, but by the spreadsheet. Don't be the person who only knows the surface. Know the numbers, know the debt, know the truth. Because in the end, the accountants always write the final chapter.